The candles had been burning since morning. Every window of Ashmore Hall was draped in black crepe, and the carriages had arrived since 10 o'clock, their wheels silent on the gravel, as though noise itself had been asked to observe a courtesy. The servants wore black armbands they had sewn themselves, without being asked. The housekeeper had placed a single vase of white chrysanthemums at the foot of the stairs, and no one had moved it, because no one had wanted to be the person who moved it. In the great hall, 300 candles burned in the chandeliers above the assembled mourners, and the Duke of Ashmore stood at the lectern. He did not look like a man reading from a paper. He looked like a man who had prepared these words by carrying them for a long time, the way one carries a stone in the chest until the shape of it becomes familiar and the weight becomes indistinguishable from breathing. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who had decided that steadiness was the only offering left to give. "She was not a woman who asked to be noticed," he said. "That was, I believe, the thing I understood too late." The hall was very still. Candle smoke rose in slow columns toward the ceiling. In the 4th row, the Dowager Margaret held a handkerchief she had not used. Beside her, Miss Dorothea Fenwick sat very straight, her expression composed in the particular shape of respectful sympathy that young women of good breeding learn to wear at events that are not precisely about them. At the back of the hall, among the servants who had crowded in 3 deep at the doors, a woman in a road-worn gray traveling dress stood with her hand pressed flat against the stone wall. She had not meant to come in yet. She had not meant to come in at all. The door behind her was still open. It swayed on its hinge in the November wind, and the creak of its movement was small and unremarkable in an ordinary moment. But this was not an ordinary moment, and the creak passed through the hall like a stone through still water. He looked up. Cecily Vane, Duchess of Ashmore, returned from the dead, stood in the doorway of her own memorial service, and met her husband's eyes across 2 years of silence, and did not move. Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, looked at his wife across 300 candles and a hall full of people who had come to mourn her, and the paper in his hands went perfectly still. That was all that happened, for one long breath. She would think about that breath for years afterward. She had not expected to be standing there. She had not expected to be anywhere near Ashmore at all. Not yet. Not like this. Not in a traveling dress still damp at the hem from the post road, and with her hair escaping its pins in 3 places, and the letter she had written him folded inside her coat, where it had been for 27 months. She had expected to arrive quietly, at a side entrance, perhaps by evening, to send word ahead and wait for the controlled reunion that a woman with any remaining sense of social geography would have arranged for herself. But the post-chaise had been faster than she calculated, and the gates of the estate had been standing open, and the gravelled drive had been lined with carriages, and by the time she understood what kind of gathering she was riding into, she was already at the front steps. She had been presumed dead since the 28th of October, 1813. The Cecily of Hartwell, a packet vessel carrying 6 passengers across the channel from Calais to Dover, had been caught in a squall south of Duchess and had gone down in less than an hour. 3 passengers were recovered. 3 were not. She had been among the 3 who were not. The cold water of the channel had a particular quality of violence that she had not known before, because she had never been in anything that was trying to kill her, and the violence was not loud the way she had imagined drowning to be loud. It was very dark, and very cold, and very final feeling, and then a piece of the ship's broken hull had appeared under her hands, and she had held it, because the body holds things when the mind has not yet formed a plan. She had been in the water for what she later understood was nearly 3 hours, which the French physician who examined her said was not survivable, and yet had been survived, with the hull piece and a certain stubbornness of constitution that he attributed to the particular cold working more slowly on a smaller body than on a larger one. A French fishing vessel had found her before dawn. The captain, a man named Bertrand Moreau, had been on his way home from a night's work and had heard something in the pre-dawn dark that he said later he could not account for, because sound does not carry the way it had carried that morning. He had gone to look. He had found her. His family, in the small coastal town of Wissant, had given her a bed, and then 3 weeks of it, and then 3 months, because the fever that followed the cold water was not a small fever. It arrived on the 4th day and settled in with the deliberate commitment of a houseguest who has decided to stay the winter, and it had its way with her for 8 weeks before it began, slowly, to concede the territory. Madame Moreau, who had raised 6 children and buried 2 of them, and had strong opinions about the restorative powers of fish broth and dry wool, was the most significant element in her recovery, though she would never know how to adequately express this. By the time Cecily could hold a pen long enough to write her name without shaking, it was January of 1814, and the newspapers that reached Wissant with the English fishing trade had already printed the list of the lost. Her name had been on it. She had sat with that newspaper for a long time. She had read it 4 times, very carefully, because a printed list is a specific and authoritative object, and she had wanted to be certain she was reading it correctly. The Cecily of Hartwell had been listed as lost with all remaining passengers and crew south of Duchess in October 1813. 3 names followed. The 3rd was hers. It was not the simple thing she had expected it to be, reading one's own name in the column of the drowned. There was a quality of vertigo to it, as though the floor had tilted slightly and had not quite returned to level. She was here. She was alive. She had survived a thing that killed 2 other people, and she was sitting in a borrowed chair in a borrowed house in France, reading that she was dead. And underneath the vertigo, a thought she had not permitted herself to examine until that moment. He would have been told by now. Edmund would have been told. She had not let herself think about what Edmund would feel. In the 2 years before the crossing, she had learned very efficiently not to think about what Edmund felt, because the evidence she had accumulated suggested he did not feel much where she was concerned. He had been courteous to her. He had been correct. He had observed every proprietary form of their arrangement, because Edmund Vane observed every form of every arrangement. And that was precisely the difficulty. There was no way to distinguish. From the outside, a man being kind from a man being dutiful, and she had not known which she was receiving, and she had not known how to ask. She had tried, once, early in their first winter together, a tentative question about whether he was content. He had said that he was, with such careful evenness that she had understood immediately that the question had made him uncomfortable, though whether the discomfort was the question itself or its answer she could not determine, and she had not asked again. She had watched him instead, the way she watched everything she did not have words for, and she had accumulated observations she did not know what to do with. He always knew when she left a room, though he rarely acknowledged it, the way he had, on 3 occasions across 2 years, done a practical thing for her comfort, without being asked, without drawing attention to the doing, as though the thing had simply needed to be done. And he was nearest. The way he had once, at a dinner at Lord Hartfield's, said something mild and precise that had the effect of redirecting a conversation that had been moving toward a judgment of her. And he had done it so smoothly that no one in the room appeared to have noticed, including her, until she was in the carriage home and turned it over and understood what had happened. She had filed these observations carefully, and she had not known what to do with the filing, because the observations were consistent with care, and also consistent with the correct management of a household arrangement, and she had not been able to distinguish which she was inside. She had written the letter in October of 1813, the night before she took the packet to Calais. She had been visiting her cousin in Dover, a planned visit of a week that she had prolonged by 3 weeks for reasons she did not examine closely. The letter had been meant as a precaution, the kind one writes when crossing water in autumn, the kind one hopes is never sent. She had written it because she wanted, at least once, to say clearly what she had not been able to say in 2 years of drawing rooms and correct courtesy. She had loved him. That she had loved him with a thoroughness that embarrassed her given how little she had believed it returned, and that she was sorry she had not been better at showing him so, and that Ashmore had been the first place she had ever thought of as genuinely hers, and that was entirely because of him, whatever he believed of her. Then she had gone into the water, and come up again, and found herself a widow in her own marriage. She spent 27 months in France. Her health was slow. The roads were difficult. A second letter, sent through her cousin in Dover in March of 1814, went unanswered, and she did not know whether it had failed to arrive or whether the silence was its own kind of message. She waited. She recovered. She studied the newspapers when she could get them and watched the world continue without her in it, which was a strange experience that produced in her a detachment she suspected was not healthy, but which was more manageable than its alternative. She came home in the autumn of 1815. She came home because she could not come home, because whatever she had learned or failed to learn about Edmund's feeling in 2 years of marriage, Ashmore was still her house, and England was still her country, and the uncertainty of the silence was no longer something she could outpace, and she came home to this. She had arrived at the gates of Ashmore at 2:30 in the afternoon on the 4th of November, in 1815, to find the drive lined with mourning carriages and the windows draped in black. And she had understood all at once, with a clarity that was almost physical, that neither of her letters had arrived, that he did not know, that Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, believed his wife was dead, and had gathered 300 people to her memorial. If she had been thinking clearly, she would have remained in the chaise until someone of sense could be found. She was not, as it turned out, a woman of sufficient clearness on that particular afternoon, and she had stepped down from the carriage into the cold November air and walked toward the hall because her feet did not require her permission, and because 27 months was a long time to have been deciding whether to return, and the decision had apparently been made at some point without her conscious participation. The night before, she had stood in the kitchen garden. It was not a plan. She had arrived at Ashmore village by dark, too late for any sensible arrival, and the inn had given her a room, and the window of that room had looked out toward the estate gates, and she had lain awake listening to the November wind until somewhere past midnight she had put her coat on and gone out. The kitchen garden at Ashmore was enclosed by a low stone wall with a wooden gate that clicked rather than creaked, and she had loved this small fact about it since the first winter of their marriage, when she had discovered that she could come and go through it at odd hours without announcing herself to the house. It was hers, in the way that spaces become yours when you have used them quietly and often, and she had stood at the gate for a moment before going in, because she was aware that she had no right to assume it was still hers, and the awareness sat with her for a moment before she opened the gate anyway. Beyond the garden wall, the house's south face rose with its library windows lit. She had not intended to look through the window. The library window was simply there, and lit. And she had looked. Edmund sat at the library table with a single candle and a miniature portrait she recognized at once, the one commissioned in the first year of their marriage, by a painter from Bath, whom she had never particularly liked, but who had captured something in the set of her eyes that she thought was accurate. He was not reading. He was not working. He was sitting very still with his elbows on the table and the portrait resting between his hands, tilted slightly toward the candle, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man who is not performing his grief for any audience, and therefore does not know what his face is doing. She had stood in the cold and the dark, with her hand on the stone wall, until her fingers went numb. She did not think anything in that time, or rather, she thought many things, but not in orderly sequence, and none of them wanted to be examined directly. She had told herself, in Vissant, that she did not know what Edmund felt. She had told herself this so often and so carefully that it had become a kind of furniture in her mind, a large, unmoving piece she had learned to walk around. She had used it to explain why she did not come back sooner. She had used it to explain why the silence in his direction felt safer than the uncertainty of the return. She had used it well for 27 months. And now she was standing in a kitchen garden in November, looking through a lit window at her husband, sitting alone with her portrait and a candle. And the furniture had become, quite suddenly, impossible to walk around. He did not know she was there. That was the thing she kept returning to, standing in the cold. He was not arranging himself for her observation. He was not performing the correct expression of grief for the county, as he had been, with quiet dignity. In the hall where the rehearsal voices had briefly been audible through the open window earlier that evening, he was simply in the room, with the candle and the portrait, doing whatever a man does in the late hours when no one is watching and the house is quiet, and he has been carrying a thing for 2 years and has not yet put it down. His face in the candlelight looked like what she had always suspected his face looked like when it was not being managed. Older than it was. Tired in a way that sleep did not appear to be addressing. She had thought that he was thinner. She had thought that he had not been sleeping well. She had thought, quite without permission, I did this. Not the water. She had not done the water. She had been in Dover for 3 weeks longer than she intended, in the autumn of 1813, for reasons she had not examined closely. And she had made the crossing in October instead of August. And the October water was the water that had taken her under. And here was the room, and here was the candle, and here was the portrait. And the man sitting with them looked like the consequence of all of it. Not the grand, dramatic consequence of a widower in a novel, but the small, everyday consequence of a person who has lost something and has not known how to put the fact of the loss somewhere manageable. She had stood in the cold until her fingers went numb, and her feet were certain that they did not want to go back to the inn. And then she had made them go anyway. Then she went back to the inn in the village, and lay awake until the light came. The memorial service was announced in a small printed card she found at the inn's hall table, black-bordered, and she had read it twice. She should not attend. She had thought this with great clarity, and then she had put on her coat and walked to the estate regardless, because 27 months of discipline had apparently run out its supply. In the corridor off the great hall, 2 housemaids had passed her without seeing her, their voices low and busy with the particular talk of servants who believe themselves unobserved. Poor soul, one said. She was always the girl he never should have married, but she did not deserve the water. Cecily pressed herself against the wall as they went by, and waited until their footsteps had receded into the service passage. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she opened the hall door and went in. She had stood at the back of the hall behind the crowd of servants, and she had listened, and she had heard what the assembled mourners of the county had come to hear. The formal words of a great house, making its peace with loss. She had heard Mr. Gerald Caxton in the corridor before the service began. He had been speaking to a cluster of younger gentlemen with the comfortable confidence of a man who had forgotten that corridors carry sound. "It was always the unsuitable match," he said. "We all knew it from the start. The girl he never should have married. Edmund will make a sensible choice this time, and the estate will be the better for it." Two of the gentlemen murmured something. A third laughed and caught himself. She had stood in the corridor with her hand against the wall and breathed slowly through her nose, the way one breathes when one has decided that composure is more useful than its alternatives. She had been deciding this, off and on, for most of her life. Inside the hall, the service began. She pressed herself to the back wall among the servants and listened to the vicar speak of eternity, and then to two of Edmund's friends speak of her with kindness and some evident genuine feeling. And she had not expected the genuine feeling, and it had done something to her composure that she had not anticipated. Then Edmund took the lectern. She had recognized him at once, which seemed an obvious thing to say, but was not. She had spent 27 months assembling him from memory and worrying that she was constructing something more than the original material warranted, the way one inflates a beloved thing by long absence. She had looked at him in the candlelight, and he was exactly as she had assembled him, feature by feature, and the accuracy of it was almost its own kind of sorrow. He was thinner. There were marks at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. He looked like a man who had not slept well in 2 years. She had, he said, a particular quality of attention. I noticed it before I had words for it. She would listen to a person as though that person was the only matter of interest in the room. And when she spoke, you understood that she had heard you. Not the polite appearance of hearing, which is what most of us manage. She had heard you. Cecily stood at the back of the hall and did not move. She did not require spectacle. She did not require a great stage. She managed things quietly, always. Because she had learned very early that quiet management was what the world would accept from a woman of her situation. And she accepted that constraint with a grace that I have spent 2 years understanding I mistook for indifference. She had not thought he noticed the quiet management. She had done it entirely under the impression that it was invisible, that the daily arrangements she made and unmade and remade in the running of the house were of the class of things that went unremarked because they went unexamined, the way the floor goes unexamined when one is walking on it, and it holds. She was not a woman who required to be told of her own worth, he said. This was one of the things I found most admirable in her, and one of the things that, I understand now, made it easy for me to neglect saying it. She did not ask. She did not need to ask. And so I did not say it. And I have had 2 years to understand that this was not a generosity, but a failure. From the left side of the hall, she heard a murmur that resolved into a voice she did not at first place. A young woman near the Dowager Margaret, speaking low to a companion. It was always the unsuitable match, the girl he never should have married. The companion said, "Shh." The Dowager did not react, which was its own kind of information. Edmund continued. My wife was not the woman the season told me she was. I understood this slowly, as I understand most things that matter, and I am standing here today because I never adequately told her so while she was alive. I was under the impression that the manner of my regard was legible, that she could see it without my naming it. I have had considerable time to understand that I was a poor correspondent of my own interior, and that what was apparent to me was not necessarily apparent to anyone required to read it from the outside. She had read, in a French newspaper in Vicente, an account of English aristocratic grief that described it as a controlled and private phenomenon. She had believed it. She had used it, in 2 years of marriage, as her primary interpretive frame for Edmund's steadiness. He felt things, and did not show them. That the showing would come eventually. That patience was the appropriate posture. She had run out of patience in the autumn of 1813. Not at Edmund specifically, but at the uncertainty of a life conducted under a frame she could not confirm, and she had gone to visit her cousin in Dover, and then she had gone into the water, and when she came back up, the newspaper had told her he was bereaved. The newspaper had not told her what the eulogy was telling her now. Standing at the back of the hall, with the candles above and the assembled county before her, she understood that she had been correct in the observation, and wrong in the interpretation. He had felt. He had simply felt in a register she had not known how to read, which was a different difficulty entirely, and one she was revising her understanding of with some rapidity. She came to Ashmore without allies, and without the armor of familiarity, he said. And she built a life here anyway, from the materials available to her. She spent 2 winters nursing the tenants on the East farms when the fever came, and she did not ask me to know this. I would not have known it at all, except that the farmers told me themselves, and they told me with the specific warmth that people reserve for those who have helped them when they were not required to. She read to my cousin's children on Sunday afternoons. She remembered the names of the Ashmore servants' families in the village. These are not the large gestures that history records. They are the gestures that are, underneath the large ones, all of it. If you are still with this story, she thought, in the silence behind that sentence, and could not name precisely who she was addressing. The hall, the candles, the 2 years of it. I do not know what she believed about her life here, Edmund said. I hope she knew she was valued. I did not tell her as often as I should have, and the telling I owed her is now a debt I cannot pay, and the only honest thing I can do with it is say it here, where she cannot hear it and carry it. The door at her back swayed on its hinges in the November draft. It had been ajar since she entered, and she had not pulled it fully shut because some part of her had wanted to leave that possibility open, the way one does not quite close a door behind oneself when one is not certain of the room. Now the wind decided the matter. The door swung on its creak, and the creak passed through the hall at the wrong moment, in the wrong silence, and 300 heads turned toward the back. She was standing in full candlelight. For one moment, she was only a woman in a road-worn gray dress, with her hair coming loose from its pins. And then someone in the middle rows made a sound that was not quite a word, and Edmund Vane looked up from the lectern. He was 12 rows away. The candles were between them. The whole assembled mourning county of Ashmore and its neighbor estates were between them. 300 people who had come here to speak of her in the past tense, and who were now looking at her in the present one. Edmund put the paper down on the lectern. He did not say anything. He stepped down from the low platform at a pace that was not a run, because Edmund Vane did not run in a room full of people. But it was not an ordinary walk either. It was the walk of a man who has decided that everything else in the room is beside the point. The crowd parted for him. Not because anyone told them to part, but because a room full of people who have watched a man read his wife's eulogy and then seen his wife standing at the door understands, without being instructed, that it is not the moment to remain in the aisle. He stopped 3 feet from her. She looked at his face and found it unguarded in a way she had not seen it in 2 years of their marriage, which told her something about what grief had done to the architecture of his control, and about what this moment was doing to the grief. She heard the Dowager Margaret's voice from the 4th row, very quiet, saying something she did not catch. She heard Gerald Caxton behind her, at the door, saying, "Is that?" and stopping, the words cut short. Edmund did not look at any of them. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. "I am sorry to interrupt." He looked at her for another moment, and then he reached out and took her gloved hand and turned to face the hall. "She is my wife," he said. "She is standing beside me now." The silence that followed was the kind that assemblies produce when they have collectively understood something that renders all prior arrangements obsolete. The Dowager Margaret's handkerchief moved, finally. Miss Dorothea Fenwick looked at her lap with the quiet expressiveness of a young woman who has understood the precise shape of her situation and accepted it with more grace than it required. Gerald Caxton, in the doorway, was very still. The vicar, to his considerable credit, said, "God be thanked," and meant it. What followed was not the scene Cecily had imagined in 27 months of imagining, because she had imagined a dramatic thing, and this was a quiet thing, which was more like both of them than the dramatic version would have been. There were questions. There were exclamations. There was the estate solicitor, Mr. Carow, appearing at Edmund's elbow within 5 minutes, with the specific expression of a man who has complicated legal unwinding ahead of him, and is nonetheless genuinely glad to undertake it. There was the housekeeper, Mrs. Dale, arriving from the servants' side of the hall, and pressing Cecily's hands between both of hers and saying nothing at all, which was the most useful thing anyone did. The Dowager Margaret departed early. She said her felicitations to Edmund with the correctness of a woman who had not, in 30 years of managing his family affairs, ever been found on the wrong side of an event without her composure intact. She did not say her felicitations to Cecily, but she looked at her, once, with something in her face that was not quite apology and not quite acknowledgement, but existed in the territory between them. Cecily met her eyes and nodded once, because the Dowager was a woman whose confidence was built on a hierarchy that had simply, in this case, been wrong, and the hierarchy was not her fault, even when her management of it sometimes was. Gerald Caxton left without speaking to either of them. Edmund ate nothing at the memorial supper, which Cecily noticed because she had noticed, in 2 years of watching him at table, that Edmund Vane always ate something, and his not doing so now seemed like information. She ate because she had been traveling for 3 days, and her body did not care about the solemnity of the occasion. She ate, and watched him move through the hall, receiving condolences that had transformed mid-sentence into congratulations, accepting each with the same measured gravity that had driven her to write the letter in the first place, back when she had thought it was distance. Across the room, the vicar stopped Edmund with a hand on his arm and said something low and emphatic that made Edmund nod once, a slow nod that meant he had heard, rather than that he agreed. He had always nodded that way, that particular distinction visible to anyone who had watched him long enough, which was not many people, which was perhaps the difficulty. Mr. Carow the solicitor appeared again, notebook in hand, and Edmund spoke to him for several minutes with his head bent close, and she could see from across the room that Edmund's shoulders had shifted into a different posture, the one he wore when he was managing practical necessities, the one that looked like efficiency and was actually something he used to fill space until he knew what else to do. She set down her supper plate and watched him fill the space. She had spent 2 years telling herself she did not know what Edmund felt. She was spending this evening accumulating evidence for the position that she had, in fact, always known, and had been afraid of the knowing, because the knowing made the uncertainty intolerable, and she had found the uncertainty easier to live inside than the risk of its resolution. She was not sure this was admirable. She was fairly certain it was human. She understood now that the measured gravity was not distance. By 8 o'clock, the last carriage had departed down the drive. Mrs. Dale had the black crepe taken down from the library windows first, at Cecily's quiet request, because the library was the room they had always used most, and she did not want to sit in there with the black still up. The rest could come down in the morning. Edmund found her in the library at 8:30. She was standing at the window where she had watched him from the garden the night before, looking out at the kitchen garden below, which was very dark and very quiet. The stone wall just visible at the edge of the candlelight from inside. The room smelled of old books and the particular cold of a fire newly lit, the cold that lingers in a room before the warmth has worked its way into the walls. She heard him come in and heard him close the door, but she did not turn, because turning required a decision about the right moment, and she was still finding it. "Mrs. Moreau sent a letter," she said, "in March of 1814, through my cousin in Dover." "I received no letter," Edmund said. "I thought as much." She looked at the garden below. "The post was uncertain. I waited for a reply for 6 months before I assumed it had gone wrong." "You were waiting for a reply," he said. She heard the thing in his voice that she had not heard before, or had heard and had not known how to name. It was not a question, precisely. It was the sound of a man arriving at the edge of a thing he had not expected to find there. "Yes," she said. A long pause. She heard him move, not toward her, simply the shift of his weight, the floor settling under him. "When the vessel's manifest was published," he said, "your name was on the list of the lost. The Coast Guard confirmed it. There were 2 witnesses who placed you at the rail before the ship went under." "I was," she said. "Very briefly. The hull came apart. There was a piece of it." She heard him breathe. 2 years, he said. The word carried a weight she had not fully anticipated. Not an accusation, not a question. Simply the fact of it, named, the way one names a fact when one has been carrying it in silence and needs to set it somewhere external to oneself. "I was ill," she said. "The fever after the cold water was long. And then the roads were difficult. And the second letter went unanswered. And then..." She stopped. Her hands were still on the windowsill. Outside, the snow was falling more steadily now, laying itself across the kitchen garden in thin, pale layers. "I did not know whether to come back." The word sat in the room. "You did not know whether to come back," Edmund repeated, and his voice was very level, the way it went when he was managing something carefully. And she could hear, in the levelness, the thing it was managing. "I had written you a letter," she said, "before I took the crossing. I wrote it because I was afraid of the water, and I wanted to say something before I went in case I did not come up again. I have been carrying it for 27 months. She reached inside her coat. The letter had been folded so many times that the paper was soft at the creases, and her name was written on the outside in her own handwriting, a small absurd detail she had forgotten until this moment. She looked at it for a moment. Then she held it over the fire. "Cecily." His voice was sharp, the sharpest she had heard it. "I heard the eulogy," she said. The paper caught at the corner, and a small clean flame moved up from it. She did not look away. "I heard the whole of it. I stood at the back of the hall. And I heard what you said." The letter burned quickly. It was not a long letter. She had known when she wrote it that the thing one has to say when one is afraid is not a long thing. It is a short thing said plainly, and she had said it plainly. And she had said it in the same words he had said in the same hall this afternoon, in front of 300 people, with his hand around hers. The paper went to Ash. She brushed her fingers against her skirt. "There was nothing in that letter," she said, "that you did not say this afternoon. So it seemed unnecessary to keep." For a moment he did not move. Then Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, closed the distance between them and put both hands around hers, the ash and all, and she turned, finally, because the right moment had arrived, and she recognized it. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The fire was finding the walls now, the cold retreating slowly in the way cold retreats from old stone when it has been asked politely, and outside the library window, the kitchen garden was very dark and still. Somewhere in the village, the church clock struck 9, and the count of it settled into the room the way the hours settle when one has stopped counting them against oneself. Through the window, the first snow of November began to fall. Very quietly, on the kitchen garden below, on the stone wall with its clicking gate, on the graveled drive where the morning carriages had come and gone. Mrs. Dale had left a lamp burning in the hall. The chrysanthemums were still at the foot of the stairs. No one had moved them, and they seemed, in the light of this particular evening, less a monument to loss than a simple welcome home, slightly ahead of its occasion, as welcome homes sometimes are. If the winter of 1815 was the one Cecily Vane remembered longest, it was not for the drama of the memorial or the legal complexities Mr. Carow spent the following months untangling with evident professional satisfaction. It was for this: the fire finding the cold walls of the library, the snow outside the window, the ash cooling between their palms, and the particular silence of a house that has, after a long time, stopped waiting. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story of a return moved you, leave a word in the comments and share it with someone who might need it tonight.